Good evening. Let us always rejoice when we have an opportunity of uniting in these periods of meditation, stillness, quietness. Because in life as we are living it in this 20th century, the opportunities are too rare, too few for partaking in this spiritual blessing that always takes place when two or more are gathered together in the worship of God, in adoration, in prayer. Man was not meant to live by might or by power, but rather to be spiritually fed, spiritually governed, spiritually directed. And too many of us have missed that particular path of life. And through the spiritual teachings that are now reaching human consciousness in greater measure than ever before, these opportunities are occasionally provided in which we can learn the meaning of "in quietness and in confidence shall be your strength," not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. The work that we are starting will partake of quite a different nature than what we have had before. Everything seems to work together to bring about a certain phase of work. Many of you know that when we were in Holland last August, that the voice spoke twice and said that I was to return home and to remain home and to be quiet and to remain removed far from the public work. And insofar as this has been possible, I have been obedient to it. The reason for that demand that I return home to be quiet was that a higher consciousness should evolve, a further message for our work. And these can only be received in quietness and in confidence, in stillness, in silence, in an inner peace. When this work came, the work that we are starting here tonight, last Tuesday night in fact, we learned that we are leading up to the closed class which will be held in July. Therefore, instead of Tuesday night lectures, we will consider that this is a series of open classes. Classes because we will take a specific subject, at least one specific subject, each Tuesday night, and bring to light whatever the Father gives us on that subject. An open class because it will be open to the public. Anyone may come who feels drawn. And incidentally, let me explain right here that while there is a provision for anyone who may wish to contribute toward the expenses of this work, please feel that this work is open to anyone regardless of any such contribution. In other words, this work is your work, and it is here for your privilege and your pleasure. And if it leads you to further study or practice of this work, then that rests with you and whatever takes place within you during this series. But know this, that we will take up at least one specific subject each week, and we will take it up thoroughly, so that you must consider that it will be necessary for you to be alert, to hear what is said, to be able to go home and take it into meditation, ponder it, think upon it, dwell upon it, pray for light upon it, and thereby be prepared for the next work. Now, it is natural that our first subject be that of prayer. Many years ago, I would have said that our first subject will be God. But time has proven that the subject of God is of relative unimportance unless we know prayer. For prayer is the contact with God. Without prayer, it is impossible to make contact with God, and to pray aright, one must know the subject of prayer. Now, prayer has undergone many, many changes since it was first introduced to the world thousands of years ago. Prayer has gone through many forms, and at certain times in history, the highest forms of prayer have been known, have been taught, and practiced, but always by the few. Prayer is a contact with God. Therefore, to receive God's grace, it must be understood that this can take place only through prayer. Now, if all that passes for prayer were really prayer, there would be peace on earth and goodwill among men. If the millions who believe that they pray were really praying, there would be no room on earth for sin, disease, death, lack, or limitation. There is something wrong with a prayer that is not productive of results. And of course, the only results that we seek in prayer is the presence of God. Now, prayer took the form in most Orthodox teachings of petition, telling God what one wanted or what one needed, and expecting God to answer or to fulfill one's desires. The fruitlessness of such prayer brought into the world a metaphysical form of prayer which was no longer petition but affirmation. And one substituted affirmation for petition, but expected to a great extent the same benefits. prayer has gone, in some cases, to such ridiculous lengths that a minister, in a book recently published, writes this: "The next major lesson we learned is that prayer not only can stimulate growth, but when properly applied, can repress and even turn back plant growth." In other words, it can kill and destroy, too, if it's properly applied. That is taking prayer to an extreme, isn't it? Later, the author mentions the work of the bad kahunas in making sick and even killing, and terms that prayer. Now do you see why I say that since prayer is our contact with God, it becomes necessary to understand the nature of prayer in order that the fruitage of prayer, the experience of God, may be realized. Now, at the extreme other end of this minister's statement on prayer is one by Dr. Carell, and I want to quote it to you at length. Prayer should be understood not as a mere mechanical recitation of formulas, but as a mystical elevation, an absorption of consciousness in the contemplation of a principle both permeating and transcending our world. Such a psychological state is not intellectual. It is incomprehensible to philosophers and scientists and inaccessible to them. But the simple seem to feel God as easily as the heat of the sun or the kindness of a friend. The prayer, which is followed by organic effects, is of a special nature. First, it is entirely disinterested. Man offers himself to God. He stands before him like the canvas before the painter, or the marble before the sculptor. At the same time, he asks for his grace, exposes his needs and those of his brothers in suffering. Generally, the patient who is cured is not praying for himself, but for another. Such a type of prayer demands complete renunciation, that is, a higher form of asceticism. The modest, the ignorant, and the poor are more capable of this self-denial than the rich and the intellectual. When it possesses such characteristics, prayer may set in motion a strange phenomenon, the miracle. This is truly prayer, the prayer of fruitage, the prayer of understanding, the prayer of contact. You see, for God to be God, it really must be the all-intelligence of this universe. Certainly it must be the creative principle of all that exists. And it must also be the maintaining and sustaining principle of all that is. Therefore, there can be no need to tell God, to ask God, to plead with God, or in any way to try to influence God. What then is necessary? To bring ourselves into at-one-ment with God, in the same way that we do not pray to God for sunshine for our garden, but we place our garden where the sunshine is. And the sun does the rest. We have learned in these many years of practice and study and meditation that when we bring ourselves to where God is, that God's grace automatically takes over and performs its functions in us and through us, for us, without taking thought for our life, without taking thought for what we shall eat or drink or wherewithal we shall be clothed, without taking thought for anything but one thing, and that is to live insofar as we can in accord with the laws of God. Now, throughout all ages, there have been men and women set apart from the rest of the world, deep mystics, spiritual leaders, revelators. And these, because of their deep experience with God, have been enabled to teach the rest of us how to live and how to pray so as to avail ourselves of God's grace. When Jesus Christ set aside 9 of the 10 commandments and told us we only needed one of those and another which he added to it, he was not trying to encourage us to steal or commit adultery or envy. He was trying to show us how unnecessary it would be for us to be concerned about our human conduct if we were obeying the first 2, the first one and then the additional one that he gave us. To love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, and to love thy neighbor as thyself, makes it a fantastic proposition to believe that there is room left to sin. How could one sin against the neighbor one is loving? How could one sin against a God whom one is loving with all their heart and soul and mind? In obeying those 2 commandments, the Master gave us some further explanations. Forgive 70 times 7. This is one way of loving our neighbor. He told us to pray for our enemies that we may become the children of God. This is another way of loving our neighbors, only this time it's our unfriendly neighbors, but nevertheless our neighbors. Above all things, he taught us not to pray at all if we had aught against any man, but rather first to make our peace. In other words, as long as we are entertaining false concepts of either God or man, there's no use in praying, for our prayer cannot break through. When he taught that we are not to take thought for our life, but to seek only the kingdom of God, he was teaching the highest form of mystical prayer ever presented to the world and that is the one that Dr. Carell here speaks of. It is a prayer in which you do not go to God for anything, except that you go to God for the God experience. I have an idea that it becomes clear if I explain it this way. Supposing that God were seated beside you in the very next chair to you, and you were conscious of that fact. You knew absolutely, either by an inner feeling or through seeing, God right beside you. Tell me now what else you would ask for. Tell me now what you believe you would need if God was sitting right beside you. When we have the consciousness of God's presence, the awareness of God's presence, the conscious realization of God's presence, we have infinity. One man wrote that if you had God and everything in the world, you would have no more than if you had God alone. That must be true if God is infinite, for God must include all that exists. Therefore, when we have the greater, the lesser must be included. Therefore, the true prayer would be the prayer of God's realization. And now, let me bring this to your attention. Prayer is never aimed at bringing God to you. God is ever present where you are. Son, thou art ever with me. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will be with you unto the end of the world. So that, as our mystic poet has said, written, God is closer to you than breathing and nearer than hands and feet. Therefore, prayer never is directed to bringing God to you or even to bringing more of God to you, for the infinity of God, the allness, wholeness, and completeness of God is already where you are. If you make your bed in hell, this is true. God is there with you. If you ascend to heaven, God is with you. And if you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, God is with you. Now, there are appearances that contradict this. But here, too, the study of Scripture is very enlightening. Do you remember Moses and his 40 years in the wilderness? Now, there were many problems in that wilderness. There were times of hunger, times of danger, times of thirst. But if God had not been there, the Hebrews would still be there. Only the fact that God's presence was there enabled them to come out of that wilderness into the promised land. Why is it then that these wilderness experiences existed for the Hebrews and for their Hebrew leader, Moses. These problems existed only in the absence of the realization of that presence and power, and whenever Moses rose in his prayer and meditation to an actual God experience, the Hebrews were led forward another step toward their deliverance. You will remember the experience of Elijah. Elijah is persecuted by his own people, by those of his own people who had turned to Baal, that is, to the worship of false gods, to a false religion. They wanted no part of truth or truth's messenger, and so he fled to the hills, to the wilderness, and he came upon horrible days. He came upon lack and limitation. He came upon persecution. And if many of us had been there watching the experience of Elijah, we might have thought, what is the use of being a holy man? You are without God. You are deserted. You are in trouble. Perhaps even Elijah believed that. But we, now reading of his experience, notice that whenever he got into his deepest troubles, the presence of God was there, either in the form of a poor widow to feed him, cakes baked on the stones before him. Always a miracle took place, and eventually the Word of God itself saying to him, I have saved out a remnant of 7,000 of those who have not bowed their knees to Baal. And then he directed them in the direction in which he should go and find his congregation, his life, his safety, his prosperity. Evidently, even during those trials, the presence of God was there, awaiting recognition, awaiting the experience. Perhaps in the Garden of Gethsemane, had we been witnesses to that experience, we would have felt that Jesus had wasted his life devoting it to God, since here he is forsaken not only by his very disciples who have fallen asleep, but seemingly by God himself. When we witness the resurrection and the ascension, it is brought back to us then that right there in the midst of Gethsemane, on Golgotha, in the tomb, the Hebrew scripture was fulfilled. I will never leave thee. If you make your bed in hell, if you go through the valley of the shadow of death, I, your God, will be there. It is a very easy thing when troubles beset us, whether in the form of sinful temptations, disease, lack, limitation, to feel that God has abandoned us, or, what is more likely, that we have fallen out of grace because of some sin of omission or commission on our own part. Once we have had the experience of God realization, once we have felt that divine presence, we must ever after be willing to walk whatever pathway is before us, whether with thorns and a cross, whether some temporary form of danger or disease, lack or limitation, confident, assured that closer to us than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, is this God presence able to save, to perform the miracle, to bring about salvation. True prayer, realized prayer, is that moment when God contact is established, when God realization takes place. The absence of fruitage in our prayer life merely bears witness to the fact that we have not gone deep enough into our consciousness to make contact with the presence which is there and which is ever available. God is not to be found on the surface of our minds. God is not to be found through the intellect. God is not to be found except through deep prayer, a heart hunger for God, a deep desire to know Him aright. That is why the world, as a world, suffers. And that is why mystics, as mystics, have so little of it in their experience, and the little that there is sometimes joyous because of the realization of the fruitage that will follow this particular barren period. This message of the infinite way, as many of you know, began because of my own questioning while traveling the world and witnessing man's inhumanity to man, as well as what appeared to be God's inhumanity to man in permitting him to suffer sin, poverty, disease, and horrible forms of death. And to me, it was incompatible with the fact that on almost every street corner there is a church. And in every one of these churches, from dozens to thousands of praying men and women. And as a result of the search that followed, the particular revelation that was given to me forms the basis of this message. And that is that God is not on the human scene until realized. That man, whose breath is in his nostril, the human being, is living as a branch of a tree that is cut off and withereth. The Master in the 15th chapter of John told us that if we do not abide in the Word, if we do not let the Word abide in us, live in us, not for an hour on Sunday, live in us, dwell in us, that we are as a branch that is cut off and withereth. And that's what the human race is. And that's why the human race lives its little span, fed by food, water, and then withers and dies. Because it has not learned yet to live not by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. There is no greater teacher than these great illumined ones who reveal to us that you must abide in this Word and let the Word abide in you. Live in me and let me live in you. This me always being God. The Word As soon as an individual feels, through enough sin, disease, lack, or limitation, that they have been a prodigal long enough and seek to find their home in God, seek to find inner peace and quiet, you will observe that their outer life soon begins to change. To some, it comes in the twinkling of an eye, and their entire lives are made over just that quickly. With some, it is a slower process, more gradual, but it is always sure. The moment the prodigal turns to the Father's house, that very moment the Father starts out to meet him. If that were not true, we would never reach there. It is only because God is forever reaching out to draw us home that enables us eventually to reach there. And where is home, except where we are now? Here and now, the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. You need not worship in holy mountains, nor in Jerusalem, nor in time, nor in space. The place whereon thou standest is holy ground. God has no pleasure in your dying. Turn ye and live. Turn where? Right where you are, within you. The kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom is nigh unto you. Surely, closer than breathing. Therefore, at any given moment that we wish to start this trip, this return to the Father's house, it first becomes necessary to acknowledge that I do not have to travel in time or space, since God is already within me, closer than my own breathing. Therefore, I can, in this instant, turn within. If I have time and opportunity, I can close my eyes, but it isn't necessary. God responds to open eyes as well as to closed eyes. We may sink to our knees, but we do not have to. God responds on our knees or on our feet, standing up or lying down. And God is no respecter of persons. All that is necessary is that we create this vacuum, that which Dr. Carell calls complete renunciation, a higher form of asceticism. The ability to make a vacuum of ourselves in the same way that Christ Jesus did when he said, I can of my own self do nothing. If I speak of myself, I bear witness to a lie. It is the Father within me that doeth the works. There is no way for us to fulfill that, or to have the experience fulfilled in us, than that of asceticism, the ability to set self aside in the form almost of a vacuum within and pray the Father, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth, and then learn to be still enough so that that still small voice may be heard. Prayer is the contact with God. Prayer is the means through which God's grace performs its miracles in our experience. But prayer must be a listening attitude. Prayer must be a willingness that the Spirit of God fill us and perform its functions in us and through us. prayer must never be a request to God for anything, or a demand upon God for anything, or even an expectation, except that we may ask God for God itself. We may ask for God's grace. We may expect God's grace. We have no right to outline the form in which it shall appear. I am sure that Moses could never have asked God for manna, for probably until that moment he had no idea that manna could fall from the sky. All those who have shown forth the fruitage of God's grace have learned to receive that grace by a desire for God, for a longing to know God. In our work, as so many of you have experienced, spiritual healing plays quite a part. Not that any of us know anything about how healings take place or why, except that we have witnessed in all of these years that when we make this contact with God, when God is realized in meditation, that healing takes place. Not only healing in the experience of those who are praying, but healing for others there too. Very few people who come to spiritual wisdoms find all of the answers or all of the problems solved in the early stages when they are praying for themselves. Usually it is when the student begins to pray for others that their own problems begin to disappear and to dissolve. You can see the reason for this if you study the life and the mission of Christ Jesus. You have no record in his 3 years of his praying for his own health or for his own supply or even for any form of good in his own experience. His every prayer is on behalf of those who turn to him for help. So it is with students who go far enough in meditation and in prayer work, they eventually reach that place where it becomes fruitless to pray for their own health or their own supply. And I might say it becomes needless. It doesn't mean that on this spiritual path we do not have problems. As a matter of fact, the higher one goes on the spiritual path, the more problems one meets, only they become more joyous. I'm thinking this moment of Paul, who before his illumination had no problems of supply. Not only he came of a family of means, but he had a business. He was a tent maker, and a good one. And he had only himself and his family to support, and life was a very simple experience so far as supply was concerned. But you will notice that after his illumination, the day finally came when he had 7 churches to support. They didn't chip in to support him. They called upon him for funds to support them. That was a problem, but I'm sure that for him it was a joyous one, and probably not too difficult. In the same way, as the ministry of Jesus Christ and his disciples grew, the demands upon them grew for healings, for supply, for comfort, for all things. And they were very busy then with prayers and problems, only that busyness was a joyous busyness. Everyone in this modern age who has embarked upon the spiritual path has found this joy, and has found the joy even in the problems that arise. I would not have you think for a moment that the land of milk and honey comes before the 40 years. It comes, but during those 40 years you meet with all of the problems of human existence, only you look upon them not so much as problems, but as experiences and opportunities. Just imagine this, that every deep problem that comes to you is an opportunity for overcoming. And in the end, the Master says, I have overcome the world. He must have had a good struggle before he overcame it, but he did, and he joyed in it. So it has been with every spiritual leader. Communion with God is the most sacred experience that can ever come to an individual. But provision has been made that it can come to every individual on the face of the globe, be he saint or sinner. God did not withhold himself from Moses because Moses had sinned. God did not withhold himself from Paul, who, as Saul of Tarsus, had certainly sinned mightily. God did not withhold himself from the thief on the cross, who was taken into paradise this very night. No, provision has been made in the divine scale that every individual may know God, may experience God, may know inner communion with God face to face. The price that we pay for that experience is our devotion, is this very ability to set aside the mundane pleasures and profits of life so that we may seek the higher glory. It doesn't mean leaving the world for a monastery or a convent. It doesn't mean taking a poverty vow. When we are told that it is more difficult for the rich and for the intellectual, it does not mean that the college man is barred or the millionaire. It merely means that the college man who has set intellectuality above spirituality, or the rich man who has set the desire for fame and riches above those periods of meditation and spiritual communion with others on the path, to them, of course, the experience is barred until they too wake up and find that they have been prodigal sons. Our work has revealed to us that if we start as young students on the spiritual path to give 3 or 4 meditation periods out of each 24 hours, even if they should only consist of 3, 4, or 5 minutes each, that we are starting in the right direction, and by following that will eventually arrive. Certain it is that after you have learned to set these 3, 4, or 5 short periods aside, that the very act of meditation itself prolongs itself, so that soon you will find, without consciously knowing it, that you are giving 5, 6, or 7 minutes to your meditations, and soon thereafter you will discover that you have given 6 periods in the day. And it is by this process that ultimately you reach the place where 20, 25, and 30 times a day you turn, even if it's only for a second, to this realization of God. This is to pray without ceasing. This is to live and move and have your being in an atmosphere of God. This is really to abide in the Word and let the Word abide in you. And you can still be taking care of your business, of your art, of your profession. Not only not neglecting them, but finding tremendous new capacities for fulfilling them. Do not be satisfied with any prayer that falls short of God realization. That doesn't mean that you ought to expect your next prayer period to fulfill itself in that way, but that at least must be the goal. Will not be long before that goal is attained. A wonderful thing about prayer is this: only in prayer is it possible to lose all sense of separateness from each other and from each other's interest. There is no intellectual way to bring yourself to believing that we are all equally children of God. There is no way intellectually to convince yourself that your interest is my interest and my interest is your interest, and that what benefits any one of us must benefit all. There is no way to believe that with the mind or the intellect, because all material sense testifies to the opposite. It is only in inner communion with God that you find yourself in inner communion with man. And then you'll find that man doesn't mean white or black, Oriental, Occidental, Jew or Gentile. Man means man, that which we are, one. Just one infinite, equal Son of God. That can never be through the mind. That can only be through the soul. That can only be when we are in communion with God that it is revealed to us that we are all one. Anything that enslaves one brings the world into slavery. Anything that sets one man free tends to be a freeing source for the entire world. Anything that impoverishes one man, one race, one sect, impoverishes the world. Anything that brings one grain more of supply into the life of an individual, a race, a nation, tends to set the entire world free of lack. You can't ever believe that with your mind. You can't ever convince a materialist of that. It takes an inner communion with God to reveal to you why you should be praying for your enemies even in the midst of war. Do you realize the import of the Master's words? You must pray for your enemies that you may be called, that you may become children of God. The first thought that comes from the materialist when he hears this is, Do you mean I should pray for my enemy to be successful over me? And that is the thought that comes to a materialist. Those of spiritual vision know that you are not praying for your enemy to be successful in deceits, trickery, injustices, slavery. You are praying that your enemy's mind be opened and receptive and responsive to the will of God, which is the same prayer that we need for ourselves. It really makes no difference whether we call a nation allies or enemies. The same prayer must prevail. Open our eyes that we may see with spiritual vision, and open their eyes that they may see with spiritual vision, and then there will be no more wars. In spiritual communion, you become so one with God that you become one with children of God, wherever they may be, whoever they may be. When you commune with God, you become so at one with God that you become one with the infinity of God's supply. And never believe that you can come into God's grace and supply unless you have first made contact with God Himself, or itself, whichever way you see God. Health, physical health, can be acquired physically, but that isn't really health. It's too subject to change. True health comes in our communion with God, because then the Spirit of God becomes our health. The law of God governs our health. The life of God is our health. Therefore, with all thy getting, get God. And those things such as health and supply and companionships and homes and abundance, all of these things will be found to be added. They're not really added, they're included.